Okay, and I'm back. Um, so I'm coming to you guys by myself this week due to some technical complications. It'll just be me this week without Dr. Shackelford. We had recorded a video about 2 hours worth of video this morning, and because of an error on my part, none of the audio made it into the recording. Uh, just a small mistake I made with the software I used to record these. Um, I had it set to the wrong audio input device, so all of that was basically lost, unfortunately. So, for the sake of time, I'm recording this to try and get it up on the same day. We'll see whether or not that happens. Hopefully, it does. So, just using my webcam to record it, which is why the video probably looks a little grainier than normal. I apologize for that. And it'll just be me covering Benatar's book, The Human Predicament, this week. I'm going to do my best to cover all of the points that Dr. Shackelford and I covered in our discussion earlier today, and I'll do my best to cover all of the points that I think he would want me to cover for this book. First thing, as far as assignments and everything, everyone's doing great with the discussion questions and the reaction papers. All of that is great. Struggling through the last half of Coin's book, but that's fine. Struggling through it, but in a good way. I think everyone's engaging with the arguments, even if they don't necessarily agree with everything, but that's totally fine. We expect you to fight with some stuff and not agree with everything. As long as you're, engaging with the arguments on like a logical level. And we're going to talk a decent amount about that today as well with Benatar's book. Engaging with the arguments rather than, sort of other extraneous things outside of the arguments, like personal sort of hang-ups or emotional knee-jerk reactions. So we'll talk about that. This Wednesday, I will be uploading the exam submission assignment to Moodle. So just like your reaction paper assignments, how you click the link to submit those, you'll do the same thing for the exam once that is up. I will upload that assignment Wednesday at noon. The assignment will be due the following Wednesday at noon. You will have a full week to complete your exam. So when I upload, or when I update the Moodle page with the exam assignment, it'll have the submission link, and then it'll also have attached to it a little Word document with all the instructions for the assignment, for the exam. So it'll tell you everything you have to do, but the long and short of it is you will have a question for each of the books that we read this semester, one question per book, and a 3-page response per question. So three double-spaced pages for each question, and you'll have a total of 4 questions for Darwin, Dawkins, Jerry Coyne, and David Benatar. And the other thing is, from the time that the exam is available to the day before it's due. So I'm going to upload it this Wednesday, which is the 17th at noon. It'll be due the following Wednesday, the 24th of June at noon. And you will be allowed to send drafts of your exam to me up until Tuesday, the 23rd at noon. As long as you get a draft of it to me by noon, the Tuesday before the exam is due, I can give you comments and suggestions, or if it's already good, I can tell you, this is an A paper, no need to fix anything. But your draft submissions have to be in by then, by 12 noon at Tuesday, the day before they're due, at the latest, if you want me to give you feedback on it. Other than that, oh yeah, and the videos. So there'll be, actually by the time this video is uploaded, they'll already have been posted to Moodle, but the 4 podcasts actually, by David Benatar, the author of this book, should have been uploaded. Well, will have been uploaded to Moodle by then. And I guess that's a good segue to start talking about the author of this book and some of the things that Dr. Shackelford and I mentioned in our now lost video discussion. One of the things we talked about was why all podcasts? Why are there no video interviews of David Benatar? The reason for that, and you cannot find videos or any pictures even of David Benatar online or anywhere that you might search for him. And the reason for that is because he does not want anyone to personalize the arguments that he's making in this book and that he makes in his the book that came before this one, Better Never to Have Been, which is where he mostly puts forth his antinatalist argument, or the argument that it is immoral to have children. He doesn't want anyone to associate him, like his face, with his ideas or his arguments. He wants those two things to be separate. And he'll often say, people will ask him in interviews things like, "Oh, well, you think it's wrong to have children? Well, do you have any children yourself?" And he doesn't usually answer this question. Sometimes he does, and he'll say, "No, I don't have any children. But even if I did, it wouldn't matter. Whether or not I have children doesn't really have any bearing." He'll even say, whether or not I'm a hypocrite, that has nothing to do with the strength of my argument as to whether or not it's moral or right to have children or not. And so that's sort of his reasoning behind keeping his face hidden. Not hidden, but just refusing to have it photographed and put up online publicly, because he doesn't want people to sort of tie him to his ideas. He wants them to sort of stand on their own, if that makes any sort of sense. So that's our author. That's who we're working with this week, David Benatar, the author of The Human Predicament. And I guess the next sort of thing to talk about before we actually get into talking about the book is why this book. In the class titled Evolution, Science, and Superstition, where we read, Charles Darwin, and we read his evidence for evolution by natural selection, which is supposed to be an evidence-based way of looking at, natural processes in the natural world and biology and all that. And then moving on to Richard Dawkins, who sort of gives us in The Greatest Show on Earth an update of the evidence for evolution, just basically more evidence for evolution by natural selection. Basically just providing further evidence for what Darwin argued in The Origin of Species, that there is evidence, and if you use evidence-based thinking and logic, natural selection is sort of the only reasonable conclusion that you can reach as to the existence of all sort of natural life. And there are other pieces of evidence using evidence-based thinking that support this assertion that aren't necessarily based on biological life, like carbon dating and geology and other sorts of things, pointing to, the age of the Earth being much older than the couple of thousands of years that is, often quoted by religious people or people who argue for sort of divine creation or divine creation of the world or all natural life or what have you. And, it's not just using evidence-based thinking to support or, support an argument for natural selection, but also to sort of break down or deconstruct arguments for theistic creation or divine creation of either the earth or biological life. And we move then to Coyne, who spends less time giving the evidence for natural selection and spends more of his book sort of explaining why faith and fact are incompatible, or why evidence-based thinking and faith-based thinking are incompatible, because they use very different processes or methods and reach very different conclusions much of the time. But even if they didn't, which sometimes that is the case, sometimes there are scientists who are more amenable to religion and vice versa. There are religious people, very devout people of many religions, who will accept they will accept some certain claims that science makes about the universe, the truth claims that science makes, they will sometimes accept. But that just because they do sometimes not reach the same conclusion, but agree on the same conclusion for certain things, Coyne still argues, and I think makes a good argument, that the process by which faith and fact separately approach these questions is very different, and faith is sort of at a disadvantage in the sense that it isn't really capable of reaching the same kinds of conclusions that evidence-based thinking or science is. Sorry, that was my cat. And okay, so that was just a brief recap of the 3 books that got us up to this point, which still begs the question, why this book? And Dr. Shackelford, when I was talking with him earlier today, made the point that you can make a sort of similar argument for or I guess you can look at this book in a similar sort of way. The arguments that David Benatar presents in this book, similar to the arguments made throughout a lot of science, are sort of susceptible to non-evidence-based thinking or faith-based thinking or whatever. Not even necessarily religious thinking, just non-evidence-based thinking. They're sort of susceptible to people using that kind of reasoning to attack or criticize or deconstruct the arguments in this book. Even though this book isn't necessarily making scientific claims, although it does use scientific evidence to support its claims, it's not really making scientific claims, or what Jerry Coyne might call truth claims about the universe. It's making more sort of moral, philosophical claims using evidence-based thinking. And some of the arguments that David Benatar presents in this book are very unsettling to people. So people often, in response to David Benatar's arguments, resort to these sort of emotional knee-jerk reaction arguments or counter-arguments to his points. But those don't really hold up. in response to his evidence-based arguments. And that's sort of what I hope, and I think what Dr. Shackelford hopes that you'll get out of this book in the context of this course. When I read this book and Better Never to Have Been, which is Dave Benatar's previous book, it was in a different context than in this class, but I think it's helpful to look at it in, here in evolution, science, and superstition, for the reasons I just mentioned, because I think it sort of, this context or this course sort of puts you in a better position, hopefully, to look at the arguments more objectively. And because the arguments are so sort of, they can put a bad taste in your mouth, I think looking at the arguments in this context, in this course, makes it more agreeable, and it makes it easier to look at the arguments in a more objective sort of way. And I think even if you look at them that way and you still don't agree with them, it gives you a better sort of toolkit to combat those arguments or offer counter arguments, because you're engaging with the logical sort of points of the argument. You're arguing with the facts more than how you feel about them, or your sort of, whatever sort of emotional or psychological hang-ups you might have with the arguments that David Benatar makes in this book, namely that coming into existence is a serious harm, and it is not easily escapable through death. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's start with the first chapter. He gives sort of like a short preface and then a reader's guide, but we can skip that and get right into the introduction, which is also, I think, fairly brief. Yeah, it's only like 12 pages. And he starts off talking about, in chapter 1, life's big questions. On page 4, starts talking about pessimism and optimism in regard to the human condition, and says also that the human condition, or the human predicament, is shared also by many animals and much of biological life. So what he's talking about on the first page with life's big questions is ultimately questions about meaning and existence, and how we should address those questions and how those questions should be framed. And those, I think, will make more sense when we talk about meaning in chapter 2, because meaning and meaninglessness in chapters 2 and 3. And I think, so Benatar basically says that, if we're going to talk about these things, then they're going to require a bit of defining. When we talk about meaning, what are we talking about? And from what perspective do we talk about meaning? And from what perspectives is meaning relevant? And this is going to be a pretty large part of his arguments about the human condition and why it is an unfavorable one, more or less. He talks also in this section about the badness of death, which we'll talk more about in chapter 5, cosmic meaninglessness, which we'll talk about shortly, and given the badness of death, how escaping the human predicament through life, the human predicament in life through death is not really, it's not a very attractive sort of solution. He talks about pessimism and optimism basically to say that, the view that he'll be taking in this book is a pessimistic one, but he does not think it is unduly pessimistic. He doesn't think it's too pessimistic. And he goes on to define a view that is too pessimistic as one that is more sour or more what's the word he uses? So he says one is too optimistic if one thinks that things are or were or will be better than they actually are. One is too pessimistic if one has a more negative assessment than one should have. I shall be arguing that a generally pessimistic view is the more realistic view, that is, the more accurate view. So he's saying basically that just because your view is pessimistic, that doesn't mean it's inaccurate because it's sort of left of center. He's saying that no, pessimism is the more accurate view than saying a neutral, and especially it's more accurate than having an optimistic view, at least in regards to the human predicament. That being that people are born and thereby come into existence and then live lives that are almost always less than ideal, and then they die. And that is the fate of every human that has ever lived and conceivably ever will live. And that is the predicament, and that is a bad one. So he is thus arguing that a pessimistic view is the right one to adopt. And also that we are not alone in this predicament, that we share it with many animals who similarly, though they may not appreciate or understand it at the same level that we do, they also, animals like our pets or animals that are farmed and become our food, or, any animal comes into existence against its own will or against no animal, including humans, have any interest in coming into exist before they do. However, once they do exist, against their own volition, they usually have an interest in continuing to exist, or in other words, not to die. So basically, you have humans and animals who are being forced into existence where they otherwise would not have, the pre-existing humans and animals didn't have any interest in coming into existence, and then once they are forced into that unfavorable position, they usually don't want to die. Nevertheless, all those animals and humans are still doomed to perish at one point or another. So, with that sort of cheery introduction, that gets us into chapter 2, which is on meaning. And I think the reason that this chapter is included in the book and why Benatar includes it so early in the book is that these big sort of questions about the human predicament are usually very closely tied to questions of meaning. Probably because that's, for a lot of people, a really big sort of reason not to continue living where they otherwise would not necessarily, but just meaning feels sort of comforting, I think. That people can feel as though their lives have meaning. That's a big sort of deterrent against feeling like you are indeed in a predicament. If you feel like what you were doing in your life as a human has a grander sort of meaning, or a meaning that transcends yourself in some sort of way, it can sort of distract you or even comfort you in the face of your eventual death. And I think that's why he talks about it here. Now, what he says, though, is that although meaning could transcend yourself in the sense that your life could have meaning at a global level, like you could have meaning in reference to the rest of the species, the rest of the human species. One, that's not a horribly realistic goal to achieve. Very few people actually achieve meaning at that very large scale or level. But even still, you can't get above that. So if you look on page 22, he lays out the different types of meaning. So you have subspecies hominis, which is individuals, and then he goes up to meaning on the level of communities, and then meaning on the level of humanity. And then that's all the terrestrial meaning. And by terrestrial, he means all of the meaning that is confined to Earth, basically, on everything that we know, and every one that we know. That's about the best, that is the best that we can hope for in terms of a meaningful life. And then above that, you have cosmic meaning, or subspecies aeternitatis, meaning at the level of the entire universe. Not, and he explains this in the chapter, not necessarily meaning from the literal point of view of the universe, because the universe does not have a subjective point of view, but just meaning on from the perspective of the universe, if it did have a point of view. So if you could anthropomorphize the universe to have sort of a view or a lens, could our lives have meaning from that level? And Benatar argues no. We will never achieve that level of meaning, and the best we can hope for is meaning at the level of humanity, or more realistically, at the level of the community, our various sort of communities or friend groups or whatever, or at the individual level, so meaning in relation to individual friends or family members or whatever. That's much more realistic. And that's okay, is, what he argues. That is, for many of us, that is acceptable. And for the most part, if we think that that is an acceptable level of meaning, then that's good, and that is. And it's good that many of us are content to sort of achieve meaning at that level. But what he also argues against, similarly to cosmic meaning, and this is sort of where we're getting into the evidence-based arguments, is that Benatar is arguing against any cosmic meaning in the theological sense, that you may have meaning after death, which I think would fall under the umbrella of cosmic meaning. Benatar makes the point that just because he does not personally happen to believe in an afterlife shouldn't make any sort of a difference, really. But the main point being that meaning on that level is unlikely, and as there is no evidence for an afterlife, as far as he sees it, there's no reason to think that meaning at that level after death is achievable, or any sort of reasonable goal. And similarly, again, using evidence-based thinking, meaning in any kind at the cosmic level that transcends your terrestrial and limited life on Earth is just, it's non-existent. So starting on page 27, he starts the section called the somewhat good news, which is where he, like I said, basically makes the argument that although we will never achieve cosmic meaning, and although many people do wish they could achieve some kind of cosmic meaning, or meaning that transcends their terrestrial lives, that is not going to be the case for most of us. However, we can achieve meaning at the individual level, at the community level, subspecies communitatis, and then at the level of humanity. Right. Okay. And yeah, he gives examples of different sort of people who, even at the humanity level, may have contributed. Uh, and he also makes a very good point that these different levels of meaning can be mutually exclusive. Someone could lead a very fulfilling or meaningful life from the perspective of the human race, or at a global scale, um, but have very unfulfilling or unmeaningful, or meaningless, I should say, interpersonal lives, maybe with their family, or they had a bad relationship, or they contributed very little to their local community, but still made very large contributions in the forms of like inventions or what have you. And he gives some examples of those. And then moves on in chapter 3 to meaninglessness, starting first with the bad news, which is that, he says here on page 35 at the beginning of chapter 3, the most expansive kind of meaning that we could want for life is what we might call cosmic meaning. This is meaning from the perspective of the universe, or subspecies aeternitatis, as this perspective is sometimes known. Now, as I noted in the previous chapter, speaking literally, the universe itself has no perspective. The universe is not an experiencing subject. It has no point of view. However, the suggestion is not that this perspective of the universe be taken literally. It should no more be taken literally than the phrase "a God's eye view" need be taken literally. And then on page 36 at the top, many people who are concerned that life is meaningless are usually thinking about meaning from a cosmic perspective, as I illustrated at the beginning of chapter 2. So that's basically why it's so important that he frames chapter 2 the way he does. I forgot to mention that when we first started talking about it, but yeah, that's basically why he separates those 4 different types of meaning, and he sort of, makes the hard line distinction. Go ahead and forget about cosmic meaning, because it's not attainable. It's not achievable in any sort of sense that any human has ever achieved any cosmic meaning in any sort of way. So if we're going to talk about meaning, and if we're going to have any sort of optimism or good news in reference to our human predicament, it's going to be in these 3 forms of terrestrial meaning. So he continues, they notice how cosmically insignificant we are. Although we collectively can have some effect on our planet, we have no significant impact on the broader universe. Nothing we do on Earth has any effect beyond it. The evolution of life, including human life, is a product of blind forces and serves no apparent purpose. We exist now, but we will not exist for long. That is true of us as individuals, but in the grand sweep of planetary time, let alone cosmic time, it is also true of our species and all life. So, yeah, that gets actually at a lot of stuff that he'll talk about later also, such as he talks about immortality later in the book in chapter 6 or 7, 6 I think, and even in terms of that argument, there's nothing we could do that'll outlast our species, because eventually everything will die. And for most of us, we will be forgotten within a couple of generations, as is probably the case with most of our ancestors. Most of our great-grandparents, or our great-great-grandparents, are a distant memory to most of us, as we will be to our great-grandchildren if we reproduce, which, as Benatar argues, we should not, for these reasons, that ultimately, not only in the immediate sense are our lives bad, so by continuing to reproduce, we are imposing serious harms on any children we create, but also any sort of starry-eyed, unrealistic fantasies we have of our children continuing our legacy indefinitely into the future are just that. They're fantasies, especially in light of the very good evidence that no matter what we do or no matter how long we prolong our species, it'll be wiped out when our sun dies, or failing that, it'll be wiped out after the heat death of the universe, which he also references a couple times throughout this book. So that's the bad news. He goes on to talk about the theistic gambit in the next section, which is, again, as I mentioned in that previous chapter, got a little ahead of myself, but basically talking about what he says when he means by gambit is the hope or assumption or gamble that there is some sort of afterlife. And that's not just a gamble on our parts, but, it's sort of a gamble you make when you create new children. If you think, well, even if you try to push everything else he says away and say, well, okay, well, maybe, or I think it's fine to have children because my children will live on in an afterlife. And he calls this a gambit because it's not a sure thing. You're creating new life who will suffer and struggle with exactly these kinds of questions of meaningless for their entire lives before ultimately dying, and then maybe, they will, based on that line of reasoning, maybe they will live on in some sort of afterlife. So I want to see if there's anything I actually want to read from this section. Many theists, this is the bottom of page 36, many theists believe that even if our lives seem meaningless from the cosmic perspectives, they are not in fact so. This, they say, is because we are not an accident of purposeless evolution, but rather the creation of God who endows our lives with meaning. According to this view, we serve not merely a cosmic purpose, but a divine one. This is a seductively comforting view. For that reason alone, we should be suspicious of it, given how easy it is for humans to believe what they would like to believe. Many people have raised the objection that theism cannot do the meaning-endowing work it was purported to do here. For example, it has been suggested that serving God's purposes does not suffice, as this makes people puppets of the hands of a superior agent or mere instruments of the goals of God. A related objection notes that not merely any divine purpose would give us the kind of meaning we seek. It has been created to provide a negative lesson to some others, don't act like them, or to provide food for passing intergalactic travelers who were important. Our lives would not have the sort of cosmic meaning we seek. So he even engages with the theistic argument, not just putting it aside and saying, oh, well, that's unrealistic, but he even, he entertains that argument for a minute to say, well, okay, even if that were the case, there are very few instances in which that would be true, and we would still have the kind of meaning that we're looking for and the sort of meaning that we're interested in when we say cosmic meaning. So again, making the argument that really it's just more reasonable and in the long run less disappointing if we focus on terrestrial forms of meaning. And then he goes on to talk about nature's purposes. Is that where he talks about the theistic, or maybe it isn't. Oh, yeah, no, it is. So on page 45, he talks about nature's purposes, sort of to set up a counter-argument to the theistic gambit made by, secular individuals, or, atheistic, or at least agnostic individuals, who try to argue that even in spite of a lack of theistic cosmic meaning, that we could still have some level of cosmic meaning for nature's purposes, and basically saying that because nature or natural biological processes are the result of all biological life, or resulted in all biological life on Earth, then maybe we have some sort of purpose from that perspective, some sort of naturally given purpose by the processes of evolution and natural selection that result in us being here. And Benatar kind of explains that this argument, the people who forward this argument sort of say, like, because nature produced us in such a way that we want to survive and reproduce, natural selection and sexual selection, what Darwin would call it, then that must be our purpose. That's our naturally given purpose. But Benatar argues, no, I don't really buy that either, because that sort of falls prey to the naturalistic fallacy, or this idea that because things are this sort of way, then that must be how things ought to be. And that doesn't really track anywhere else. It's, there are other sorts of things found in nature, like, nature, non-human animals is rife or filled with murder and rape and parasitism and all other sorts of nasty things that are technically natural, but I don't think most sane people would make the argument that those things are morally correct because they're natural. And Benatar argues that that's the same case here, just because nature has produced us in such a way that many of us wish to survive and reproduce. It in no sense makes that natural. So that's how he kind of knocks that down as well. On 47, talking about scarce value, setting up the argument that, if there is no other life in the universe, and if we possess value, then we kind of have a monopoly on all the value in the universe, which means that we have a lot of significance. And again, Benatar says that this is absolutely not the case, nor do any of the individual parts of that argument really hold up, just because, for one, assuming that we have any value from the cosmic perspective in the first place, but then, extending that argument to say that just because we have value, then we must have all the value, and all of the value that we have is immense, is sort of, it's a rather weak claim on multiple fronts. Benatar sort of knocks that down. Chapter 51, discounting the cosmic perspective. And on 56, continuing to, focusing on terrestrial meaning. All of this chapter basically adding up to say it's sort of the flip side of the argument he sets up in chapter 2, which is to say that the reasonable sorts of meaning we can hope for are terrestrial, and for many good reasons, Benatar argues. Any sort of cosmic meaning is not achievable, it's not realistic, and in some ways it's not really, doesn't really even exist in the way that many people purport it to. There's no real cosmic significance or meaning to even speak of in the first place, let alone for any human to achieve. So that gets us through sort of that big question of whether or not our lives have meaning. And he says that yes, our lives can have meaning, but it depends on which perspectives we talk about, and whether or not we have meaning and whether or not we perceive our lives to have meaning is going to have pretty profound implications for the severity of our predicament. But even regardless of whether or not we perceive our lives to have meaning, he goes on now in chapter 4, starting on page 64, to make the argument that our lives are of much lower quality than we often give credit for. Okay. All right, back. And so talking about chapter 4, quality, this is the chapter in which Benatar makes the argument that our lives are of significantly poorer quality than we often recognize, which is a pretty important part of his argument overall for the human predicament. For if the quality of our lives were not bad, then we would not really be in a predicament, as he argues. And a large part of this chapter he dedicates to pointing to evidence that humans do have an optimism bias, and also in line with using the kind of evidence-based thinking and reasoning that we want to encourage and do as much as possible of in this class. Not only is there a lot of evidence in psychology and in psychological science that points towards the existence of this optimism bias, but also using the theory of natural selection as sort of a predictive or heuristic tool, you would predict that our human ancestors would be those who had an optimism bias that gave them a sort of sunnier or rosier outlook on their lives than what they really had, especially our ancestors who would have had a much harder, shorter, nasty life than most of us currently live. So without that optimism bias, Benatar argues, those people would not have been our ancestors. So here on page 67, he begins the section, Why People's Judgments About the Quality of Their Lives Are Unreliable. And here, again, it's important to use these sort of evidence-based arguments, not only because, we don't want to fall prey to using religious or, just non-scientific arguments, but we also don't want to fall prey to those emotional sort of knee-jerk reactions I mentioned earlier, in which we sort of make the snap judgment that, I don't feel like my life is of poor quality, and no one I know on average feels like their life is of poor quality most of the time. So how can it be true that my subjective feelings about the quality of my life are objectively wrong, according to Benatar? And I think he makes a pretty good case that is in fact the case. And, thankfully we do have that optimism bias. And if we didn't have it, if we actually had an accurate, on average view of the quality of our lives, then our lives would actually be even worse, because our subjective assessments of our lives actually, in turn, influence the quality of our lives as well. So having a higher subjective assessment of our lives, in turn, creates sort of a feedback loop in which we then have a higher actual quality of life. So he not only points to evidence that humans have an optimism bias, which comes from studies that show that people tend to overrate their good experiences and underrate their bad ones. They remember their positive experiences better than they do their negative ones. But he also says that objectively, if you just sort of count it out, our negative experiences, no matter how small, such as being tired, being hungry, being uncomfortable, though these may seem to be very small inconveniences to most people. Most people would sort of say, you know, that's sort of nitpicky, or that's a bit whiny to count those minor things that everyone experiences on a daily basis as evidence for a poor quality of life. But Benatar is saying, no, that's precisely my point, which is that, you know, we do experience these things on a daily basis, but just because we habituate to them does not necessarily mean that they aren't negatives, that they don't detract from the quality of life, and that they shouldn't be included when sort of measuring quality of life overall. So, to rewind a little bit, as I was saying, we experience these things every day, and for most of every day, as to where, for one, the joys in life on a daily basis, on average, are few and far in between these discomforts and these displeasures. And that's, sort of putting aside the larger joys or pleasures that we get to experience less frequently, and also the larger pains and negative experiences that we also experience less frequently, but still more frequently than the rare pleasures and the rare joys. So on average, just the daily discomforts and inconveniences are protracted, meaning they're longer, and they are more plentiful than the joyous or pleasurable experiences. And further, our joyous or enjoyable or pleasurable experiences are not only few and far in between the negative ones, but they're also usually enjoyable because they are just reliefs from the negative experiences. The relief of going to the bathroom after having to go for like a long period of time, or eating after being hungry all day, or getting to sleep after feeling exhausted. It's, I think, sort of evidence for Benatar's point that we see just a relief from pain or discomfort as a joy or a pleasure, or something to look forward to, and something a lot of people look forward to quite a bit and take a lot of or get a lot of enjoyment out of. Finally getting to take a nap, or eating at the end of the day after being exhausted or hungry. But these aren't net positives, really. They're sort of bringing us back up to baseline. So that is sort of the point that Benatar is making in this chapter. Continues on on page 71 in the section "The Poor Quality of Human Life." I apologize if you can hear the lawnmower outside my apartment. The lighting is bad, and the sound quality of this recording is going to be poor, and I apologize for that. But it is the last week, so we're almost done. Just got to power through. So in the section, "The Poor Quality of Human Life," so I'll just start on the first paragraph of this section. Most people recognize that human lives can sometimes be of an appallingly low quality. So basically saying, we do recognize that some human lives can be of just horrible quality. The tendency, however, he continues, is to think that this is true of other people's lives, not one's own. When people do think their own lives are of low quality, this is typically because their lives are, in fact, unusually bad. However, if we look dispassionately, so objectively, at human life in control for our biases, we find that all human life is permeated by badness. And this is where he gets into the daily discomforts thing that I just explained. And, he also does talk about, beyond the daily discomforts and displeasures, he talks about the often extreme displeasures that many people suffer with, and he makes another good point, which is, although most of us may usually, on a daily basis, only experience what we would call sort of like what many of us would consider at least minor annoyances or displeasures or discomforts, many people suffer from different types of illnesses, whether they be, minor or chronic or whatever. A great deal of people suffer from, if not one, then some other sort of disability, whether it be some form of diabetes or asthma or hypoglycemia, which makes their lives of poorer quality, even if people do tend to habituate to it. As he says, I'm not sure if it's in this chapter, but he makes the example of the paraplegic or someone who loses use of their legs in some way. That the tendency for people who suffer something like that is for them to bounce back, and immediately after a tragic event like that, they usually will be in pretty low spirits and think they have a lower quality of life. But then sometime after that, maybe a year or more, they usually go back to thinking that their lives are on balance, average with that of any other person. When objectively, I'm not trying to disparage anyone with that sort of disability, and neither is Benatar, but objectively, they do face difficulties that other people don't. Their quality of life is probably, all things considered, slightly worse than on average for that reason. But they don't feel that way. Most people don't. Again, that is due to the optimism bias. And then on page 76, with the section Why There's More Bad Than Good, talking about, not only the overall poor quality, but the disproportionate amount of bad compared to good. Yep, and so this is on page 77. Toward the top of the page, our lives contain so much more bad than good, in part because of a series of empirical differences. So again, looking back at that sort of evidence-based, empirical way of analyzing this. A series of empirical differences between bad things and good things. For example, the most intense pleasures are short-lived, whereas the worst pains can be much more enduring. And then he goes on to give different examples in that paragraph. But again, getting at what I was saying earlier, which is that even when we do experience pleasures, they're short-lived, and also usually just a relief from pains. So in that sort of way, things are a bit one-sided and weighted a little more heavily in terms of pains and discomforts. On page 83, he talks about secular optimistic theodicies. And so secular meaning non-religious, optimistic obviously having a positive outlook, and theodicies. So basically, this is Benatar's way of arguing that, it doesn't take someone with faith or any sort of religious leanings to make a sort of unscientific or non-evidence-based argument for an optimistic outlook on life. And so he says, human optimism is resilient. It does not wilt in the face of evidence. And this is on page 83, at the beginning of that section. No matter how much evidence one provides for psychological traits, such as optimism bias, and no matter how much evidence there is that the quality of human life is very bad, most humans will adhere to their optimistic views. Sometimes this optimism manifests, at least in part, in religious faith, with people declaring the goodness of God and his creations. Religious optimism of this kind is often challenged by the argument from evil, which suggests that the existence of an omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent God is incompatible with the vast amount of evil that exists in the world. Theodicy is the optimistic practice of trying to reconcile God's existence with evil. However, many atheists, while critical of theodicy, are themselves engaged in a kind of secular theodicy, and attempt to reconcile their optimistic views with the unfortunate facts about the human condition. And he goes on, there are many. One of the most common is that bad things in life are necessary. For example, it is suggested that without pain, we would incur more injuries. And he says, while this is true, it still doesn't change the fact that ideally human lives would be much better if there were just no pain at all. Or if somehow, we could be alerted to our pains without feeling them, or, feeling them with such intensity. Or in that next paragraph, he goes on to say that other people argue that the bad things in life are necessary in order to appreciate the good things. And similarly, our achievements are more satisfying if we have to work hard to attain them, and fulfilled desires mean more to us because we know that desires are not always fulfilled. And he goes on to explain the problems with this argument. Namely that, that argument doesn't seem to hold up because there's no reason, at least in theory, that we should have to experience pain, or pain at the, like I said, pain at the intensity level that we do in order to avoid dangers. Basically, so the argument from the secular theodicy view is that pains help us avoid danger. You hear about people who have nerve damage and can't feel pain and end up breaking their bones, or losing a lot of blood because they can't feel it. But Benatar argues there's no reason we have to feel pain to the extent that we do to help us, so that we avoid dangers. And he also makes the counter argument that there's no reason, at least in theory, that we couldn't experience the joys of accomplishments and fulfilling desires without the extreme dearth or absence of fulfilling desires or achievements that we often do. Or, there's no reason in theory that so many people have to go without meeting or fulfilling their desires almost entirely, or for long periods of time, without feeling that sense of achievement. And there's also, again, in theory, no reason that we should have to feel so disparaged and so depressed at a continued failure to achieve those desires. So I think basically in this section he's kind of making the argument that these sort of secular theodicies are just willfully optimistic in the absence of any sort of evidence. They're just kind of what I think Dr. Shackelford would probably call like special pleading. It just seems sort of like a special sort of hoping that there's a reason for things to be so bad, and that it, ultimately results in greater good, or a greater appreciation of the good things. But I don't know, it doesn't seem to hold up, and Benatar explains why in this section. And I think he summarizes it here on the first full paragraph and the second full paragraph on page 85. Finally, and perhaps most important, to the extent that the bad things in life really are necessary, our lives are worse than they would be if the bad things were not necessary. There are both real and conceivable beings in which nociceptive, that is, specialized neural pathways, detect and transmit noxious stimuli, resulting in avoidance without being mediated by pain. This is true of plants and simple animal organisms, and it is also true of the reflexive arc and more complex animals such as humans. We can also imagine being much more rational than humans, in which nociceptive and aversive behavior were mediated by rational faculty rather than a capacity to feel pain. So again, saying that there's really no reason why we have to feel pain to the extent that we do. And so the conclusion, and Dr. Shackelford and I mentioned this in our recording, in which the audio was lost. So I'll mention it here because I have not yet. Dr. Shackelford really encourages you guys to read the conclusion to each chapter. Go through and read everything, and then, especially pay attention to the concluding chapter. So chapter 8, because it summarizes all of the arguments he makes throughout the book, and then especially read the conclusion of each chapter, because it sums up each chapter really, really well. Basically, the arguments that he's making and putting forth in each chapter are just summarized really well at the end. So if you're confused about anything, and you just want to get the big picture, which again is all we're asking in this book, as in previous books, and as we've said in previous videos, the main thing we're looking for in each chapter is, or in each book, is that you get the overall big picture. So here, the conclusion, Benatar says, the optimistic delusions to which humans are prone do make the quality of human life a little less bad than it otherwise would be. In this way, they partially palliate the human predicament, or at least they do so for those who have them, that is, who have the optimism bias. The quality of life just does not feel quite as bad as it would in the absence of the rose-colored glasses. I shall say more in the concluding chapter about whether this supports an argument for an optimistic response to the human predicament. For now, we need note only that to palliate a predicament is not to elude it. So just because our optimism bias sort of deals with the poor quality of our lives, that does not mean we have successfully escaped from the human predicament, and you'll see why Benatar thinks so in the next chapter on death. Even armed with various optimistic coping mechanisms, the quality of human life is not only much worse than most people think, but actually quite awful. This may not be true in every minute or every hour of human life. There are moments of relief and pleasure, but taken as a whole, it is an unenviable condition. So, there you go. Moving on to the chapter on death, longest chapter in the book, and personally, I think I mentioned, I've read this book before, and both the first time I read the book and rereading it recently for this class, death has always been the chapter I struggled with the most. I'll try and set my own personal qualms aside for this chapter, because I do struggle a lot with the badness of death argument that Benatar puts forth and argues in this chapter. But again, that's my own personal hang-up, so I will not belabor that here. But what I will say is that it is important for Benatar to make a strong case for the badness of death, because without it, there is no predicament. As he says, I think at some point in this chapter, or if not here, elsewhere in the book, if death were not bad, then it would be a reasonable and attractive escape from life, and thus there would be no predicament, because he sets up the vice analogy as the human predicament. On the one claw of the vice, we are born without being asked to, and then we are sort of stuck in between the vice during our lives, in which we are forced to live this unenviable, unenjoyable, on average, even if we don't recognize it, unpleasant life. And the other end of the vice is death, which is an unattractive and sort of undesirable escape from the life in which we are trapped. Even those who have very poor quality of life, Benatar will argue in this chapter, often do not see death as a favorable, or they don't see death as a great solution, even if it does at certain times seem favorable to continued living. And he'll make the case here and in the chapter on suicide that often that is the decision that people are often forced to consider, is whether or not continued living would be worse than annihilating themselves or ceasing to exist in any way. But I'll try not to get ahead of myself. So just talking about death, he talks about the Epicurean arguments that death is not bad for the person who dies. Basically, this is an old philosophical argument, and one that people, I think, struggle with a lot, myself included, because I guess I struggle with counter-arguments to it. Because the Epicureans argued that death is not bad for the person who dies, because, and this is on the assumption that there is no afterlife, so there is no experience after death. Nothing can be bad for the person who dies once they are dead, because they don't experience anything positive or negative. So how can their death be bad for them? On the one hand, it seems like a very difficult thing to argue against, if you do accept that, once people are dead, they don't experience anything. How can they experience badness, including the badness of their own death? On the other hand, as some people counter-argue, and as Benatar partially counter-argues, well, how can this possibly be true if people are so afraid to die, or if even people with an extremely poor quality of life see suicide as such an unpalatable and unattractive sort of option, and the two key points that Benatar sets up in this chapter, and he uses these 2 points to sort of build up his argument that death is indeed bad for the person who dies. He sets up 2 key sort of things. The first one is that death is bad for the person who dies because it deprives that person of pleasures that they may have otherwise had, enjoyable moments that they would have otherwise have, or at the very least, it deprives them of further existence, whatever that is. And again, even though on average people tend to have, as Benatar argues, undesirable or unpleasant lives, their optimism bias makes them feel otherwise. So they have an interest in continued existence, usually because, on average, people think that their lives are either pretty good or at least not that bad. And certainly most people think, that their lives are not so bad as to want to commit suicide or just discontinue living. So that's the first part of his argument, is deprivation. And the second part is annihilation. So on top of, wanting to continue to exist, in order to not be deprived of future life, people also don't want to be annihilated. Like, he basically sets the annihilation thing, he sets that up in and of itself as a separate harm than discontinued living. That people have an interest in not being annihilated and continuing to be people, essentially. So he sets those 2 things up as arguments for the badness of death. And, I will try to sympathize with you guys here, and I'll anticipate issues that you may have. Namely that, well, it sort of sounds like Benatar is using like subjective, he's sort of using the subjective human view the typical subjective human view of, their lives as good, for to strengthen his argument that death is bad. In other words, his argument that people have an interest in continuing to exist, not being annihilated, and to keep living in the hopes of gaining future goods and not being deprived of future goods. And the typical subjective view of one's life as more positive than negative is sort of important for making that argument. And you might say, well, how can he make a subjective argument here? How can he use subjective evidence or a subjective assessment of human life here to strengthen his argument that death is indeed bad, but, sort of said or claimed that the objective fact of human life as less good or more bad than good on average, or in the vast majority of cases, he argues, objectively human lives are worse than they are good, and uses that as evidence that life is indeed a predicament. And I think the best answer to that for me is that, he uses subjective assessment in other places as well to strengthen his arguments, such as the optimism bias being a good thing and it improving quality of life. So just as it is, as he argues, good that most people do have a rosier, sunnier view of their lives than they should technically have, or they have a better view of their lives than what he argues accurate. Not only is it good that we have that, but it also results in death, therefore being worse for us than it would be if we had a more accurate view of our lives, if that makes any sort of sense. So, just because our lives are objectively worse than we typically view them as, that doesn't make death less bad for us from our subjective view. And thus we set up the predicament, the human predicament, that, we have these lives that aren't very good, and we do not have an escape from these lives, hence the predicament. So yeah, on page 98, he starts talking about sort of different aspects of the Epicurean arguments, and I'm not sure I want to spend too much time on these. They are important, and I absolutely encourage you to read them, but for our purposes here, and in the interest of time, I'm not sure they're really crucial to explaining the larger arguments to you guys. Here is one place, though, on page 110. When is death bad for the person who dies? And this section, as well as the symmetry account, I think is what he calls it. Let me find it. The symmetry argument on page 118. So when is death bad for the person who dies on page 110, and then the symmetry argument on page 118 were two places that I struggled with a great deal when I first read this book. So, anticipating that some of you may also have similar sort of hang-ups with these sections of the book, I'll just tell you that for me, what was helpful is, I guess I'll spoil it for you a little bit. He ultimately, in these two sections, comes to the, sort of conclusion that it doesn't really matter when death is, that arguing for sort of the timeline of when death starts to be bad for the person who dies, isn't extremely important for arguing the badness of death. For me, it was like a huge hang up that I had to get past in order to be convinced that death is indeed bad for the person who dies. But I think the most convincing argument that he provides, even though he doesn't really lean into it, is when he talks about death being sort of atemporally bad. Or in other words, death is sort of eternally bad for the person who dies. And he illustrates it on page 115 with Meg's leg. And if you look at that sort of line graph on the top of the page, you can see between T1 and T2 the time for which the broken leg is bad for Meg, but then that larger sort of bracket at the bottom encapsulating all of Meg's life says time at which it is true that between T1 and T2 the broken leg was bad for Meg. So although in the scope of Meg's life her broken leg was only bad for the time it was broken, it is eternally true that for the time at which it is broken, the broken leg is bad. I know that sounds kind of confusing and like it's maybe not very helpful, but turn to page 117 and he sets up the same sort of, he parallels it with Beth's death, and you can see at T1, Beth dies, and then, Beth is dead forever after that. And then, so time at which Beth's death is bad for ante-mortem Beth, that's, dead Beth. And then again, you have that bigger bracket on the bottom that says time at which it is true that Beth's death is bad from T1 or time 1. And I think this argument is a little more convincing for me, and I'll explain why. So basically, this argument is saying that, yes, Beth's death is bad for her. Well, I don't even want to put like a time on it. So ignoring that, smaller bracket, I want to focus on the larger bracket. Basically, this is saying that it is eternally true that Beth's death is bad for her. And I like this argument because it doesn't rely on saying that something is bad for the person who dies after they're dead. Because I still get hung up on the argument that nothing can be bad for the person who dies once they're dead because they don't experience anything. So it's difficult for me to really get into arguments that argue otherwise, or argue that death's badness starts at a certain time and then, continues for whatever. But the argument that a person's death is eternally bad for them, it's not sort of, you can't put it on a timeline. It's sort of like you have your life, right? Like you have your life and then encapsulating that life, sort of surrounding it, not at any certain time point. It's just sort of enclosing the entirety of life, up, down, back and forth. The death is bad for that person. That person's death is bad for them. Because I think that the badness of death, from the perspective of a living person, can be better explained as being bad for them all the time, from the moment they are born, well, really from the moment they're conceived, until the moment that they die. It surrounds them. It's the badness comes from, at least for me, the anxiety of death, or the fear of death, or the things that could end you and discontinue your existence. That is the sense in which I think most people probably think that death is bad. And it also helps you make the argument that, okay, well, if death isn't bad, then if death isn't bad for the person who dies, then why are you afraid of death? And of course, taking this atemporal stance that death is always bad, it's of course reasonable to have anxiety or fear of death, or to not want to die, or to continue living, etc. And I think that atemporal argument helps illustrate that a little bit better, for me at least. And then the symmetry argument sort of makes a similar claim but different, and basically it just says, well, if death isn't bad for you, or if nothing can be bad for a person before they come into existence, then death can't be bad for the person who dies, because nothing can be bad for you after you cease to exist either. And again, I think that atemporal badness of death sort of gets around this argument because, well, for one, it's true, nothing can be bad, or at least I agree with Benatar's argument that nothing can be bad for someone before they come into existence because there's no person for anything to be bad for. But even after you die, there was a person for things to be bad for. So even though that person's death may not, in the sense that we recognize, be bad for them after they've died because they can't experience anything and nothing is good or bad for them after they die, the fact that they did have to come into existence and then experience death is still sort of eternally bad for them. It sort of encompasses or encapsulates their entire life, and that is bad for them. But if there was never any life to begin with, then there is no goodness or badness for them. So I sort of take Benatar's point that there is an asymmetry. Nothing can be bad for someone before they come into existence. And, to sort of extend that argument, death can't be bad for someone who never comes into existence, for people who are never born, or as Benatar says in his other book, non-persons. Death cannot be bad for non-persons. If you never come into existence, then you are never forced to eventually die. But once you do come into existence, you will die, as every person or every living thing has, been faced with so far. You will eventually cease to exist. But that problem is entirely circumvented if you never come into exist in the first place. Okay, hopefully I made that clear and did not totally belabor that point. So continuing on, how bad are different deaths? I don't know if I need to talk about that. Oh, well, he does sort of talk about deaths at different times. So being annihilated at different points in time, and depending on how much life that would have deprived you of and what is the quality of that life you would have been deprived of. Again, interest of time, not going to spend a whole lot of time on that here. I will direct you guys to read that for yourselves. But it is, all of these are very interesting elements in making the case for the badness of death. And there are some points where Benatar sort of doesn't take super strong claims because it is sort of nitpicky and it may not be as important to arguing the badness of death. And, that's sort of his big overall claim here in this chapter, is that death is indeed bad. But the different details of that can vary. And I think if this is something that interests you, please, read carefully this chapter on death, even though it is long. I think it's also very interesting, and it made me think about a lot of things that I otherwise would not have. Okay, continuing on, chapter 6, immortality. And you know what, I'll just read the first paragraph of this chapter underneath the quote. Death is bad, but it does not follow... Oh, and this is on page 142. Death is bad, but it does not follow from this that being immortal would be good. It is possible that death is bad, but that eternal life would be worse. Thus, we need to ask whether the human predicament would be ameliorated or whether it would be exacerbated if we were immortal. The view that immortality would be worse than living for a limited time is one of two broad kinds of optimistic responses to the problem of mortality. That is, one of two ways of rejecting the view that our mortality is part of our predicament. The other kind of optimistic response is to deny one way or another that we are or must remain mortal. And so he starts off with the section Delusions and Fantasies of Immorality, and he actually spends, I think he spends kind of a lot of time in this chapter sort of explaining how immortality is not reasonable. It's not a realistic goal. If on the one hand, it's unreasonable because medical science doesn't seem to be there yet, and he says that in spite of the sort of optimistic claims of people in the medical field and in the medical sciences that immortality is just a couple years away. There are people living now that won't have to deal with aging or sickness or many types of illnesses. He says that people have been making claims like this for a very long time, and although it is possible that somewhere on the horizon something sort of like this will develop to the extent that people hope it will, it's also not sort of unreasonable to be pessimistic or at least wary of those kinds of claims, being maybe a little too eager or optimistic. And that's the most sort of practical level at which he disputes the promise of medical immortality. But he also goes on to say that even if it were true that we could end aging, there are other illnesses and sicknesses that could befall us that bring about an untimely end. There are accidents and other ways we could be killed, either on accident or on purpose, in vehicle crashes or homicide or whatever, war, all sorts of things that could bring about an untimely end that medical science is probably not going to cure. And sort of he resorts to the phrase, well, he doesn't resort, but he uses the phrase medical immortality. But he says this is misleading because people will die sooner or later, no matter, and this is on the bottom of page 148, no matter how small the risk of death by non-natural causes over the course of eternity, death by such causes can never be avoided. The only question is how long it can be delayed. Thus, the only real immortality is true immortality. This may be why some optimists have preferred the term extreme longevity to medical immortality. But he also sets up, even in extreme longevity, it would have to be under reasonable conditions. If we continued to age and our health deteriorated, this would not be a desirable form of extreme longevity. Further, because regardless of what we do, and even if we were somehow to avoid any accidents which might bring about our death, medical immortality, or the end of aging, and even possibly the end of aging and many common illnesses like heart disease and cancer or whatever, is still not immortality, because our sun will one day die out, which will be the end of all life in the solar system. And he even extends that and says, even if we're somehow able to escape our planet and move to a different solar system with a sun that has a little bit more life in it, at some point the heat death of the universe, or the continued expansion of all the planetary bodies, all stars and planets in the universe, moving further and further away from each other, will leave us with basically no escape. So even achieving medical immortality in that scenario would eventually result in the death of everyone and everything. And basically he's saying all this to make the argument that immortality is just not going to be an escape from our predicament. It just isn't. Um, Not necessarily because, and he even says, and it's immortality is not an unreasonable escape route from our predicament, because there are not conceivable types of immortality where we could, live enjoyable existences or enjoyable lives without the fear of death, or without the other end of the vice, which is our annihilation in the end of our lives. That's not why. He even knocks down an argument made by some that immortality would be bad even in good health because we would get bored eventually, which I think personally is sort of a reasonable argument, but I guess I wouldn't know until I tried it for myself. But Benatar actually argues against that and says that there's no reason to think, at least based on our current knowledge, that we would get sick of being alive, or that we would get bored of it. At least based on the current human lifespan, most people would opt, if given the choice, to live longer than the current average human lifespan, if they could. So we don't really have any reasonable evidence or arguments for what the bounds of human boredom are, more or less. So he makes that argument that that's not why immortality is not going to be our sort of savior. It's not going to it's not going to be our escape from the human predicament. Immortality, he argues, is just not conceivable, because if we don't die of natural causes, or of illness, or of some sort of accident, or an intentional killing, or whatever, then we'll die with our planet, and if failing that, we'll die with the universe. And he does concede that given favorable conditions, so not continuing to age or not continuing to deteriorate in health, extended life would probably be good. But immortality is not realistic. It's not achievable, and even extended life would need to meet very specific conditions for even that to be favorable or preferable to the lifespan that we currently experience on average. And then I'll read this part of the conclusion on page 160, because I think it does a good job of explaining sort of further building up the argument that human lives are indeed a predicament, and our mortality is a very large and important part of that predicament. So, bottom of page 160 under conclusion, he says, being mortal causes many humans considerable anxiety. The shadow of death looms over our lives. No matter who we are, where and when we live, and what we do, each of us knows that he or she is doomed to die. We first gain this terrifying awareness as quite young children. Insofar as we can, we put this fact out of our consciousness, but it lurks beneath the surface, breaking through at times when we cannot but confront our mortality. This awareness is one of the chief triggers of our existential angst, and it spurs attempts to find meaning. Our mortality is an unbearable limit that we seek to transcend, yet it is an ultimate limit that we simply cannot transcend in any literal way. We are not the only mortals, but as far as we know, we are the mortals with the most acute sense of our own mortality. Mortality is thus a brute and ugly feature of the human predicament. So, and he follows up this chapter on immortality, which is, sort of, I think he does this on purpose, this sort of parallel between immortality, which is the extension of life beyond what we typically enjoy, assuming we die of natural causes, and the premature ending of one's life with chapter 7, which is on suicide. Okay, and so a big part of his argument in this chapter is basically saying that life is bad, so is death. Therefore, what are the conditions under which suicide might be permissible, morally or otherwise? And he actually gives a pretty strong defense of suicide, I think. Again, not because he's like emotionally attached to defending suicide or he has some sort of personal bias towards it, but I think using this, continuing this sort of evidence-based reasoning, he argues in defense of suicide because, for several reasons, but ultimately that, death, although not a favorable or often attractive escape from life and the human predicament that we find ourselves in, it is an escape. And if one judges one's life to be of sufficiently poor quality and judges that discontinued existence would be preferable to continuing to experience the pains and dissatisfaction with life, then suicide should, in most situations, be permissible. And the one sort of stipulation he adds to that is that if you have people who depend on you, then that may not necessarily be the case. Once you have other people who depend on you for their quality of life and for their happiness and their continued existence, even such as children or elderly people in your care, then suicide, even if it would offer an escape from a sufficiently poor quality life, may still not be permissible, morally permissible. But then, so in these sections, or in some of these sections in the chapter, he sort of he builds up the argument for suicide. He sort of gives evidence for why suicide is often permissible. And on page 169, the subsection under responding to common arguments against suicide, the subsection suicide is murder, he sets up the counter argument that people often make to suicide, that it's a form of murder. You are killing someone. And philosophically, he argues that this is not the case, because killing someone, murder is murder, and in the way that we think of it, and murder is wrong in the way that it is typically considered to be, because it is taking someone's life away from them without their permission. And he argues that this does not apply to suicide because people have, and should be considered to have, in his view, a sort of ownership over their own life, in which they have the right to choose to, end it or to stop existing. They have an ownership over their own life that they don't have over anyone else's, that no one has over anyone's life except their own. So that is his argument against suicide as murder, and that's sort of the first step to arguing that suicide is rational. The second subheading is suicide as irrational. And on that second paragraph under that subheading, he says on page 173, The claim that all suicide is rational can be understood in different ways, corresponding to different senses of irrationality. One way in which somebody might be irrational is by adopting means that do not and cannot reasonably be thought to secure their ends. So in other words, people argue that suicide is irrational because it is, people use it as a way or a means to achieve their ends that don't actually achieve what they want. Thus, for example, to attempt to quench one's thirst by shaving one's head is rational because head shaving is obviously not an appropriate means to quenching one's thirst. By contrast, drinking a glass of water is rational because it is clearly one means of attaining one's end. Following this ends means view of rationality and irrationality, some suicides clearly are irrational. Suicide is not an effective means to every end. Thus, when it does not serve one's end, it is irrational. However, it should be equally clear that suicide may also often be entirely rational under the ends means conception of rationality. If one's end is to avoid those of life's burdens that can only be avoided by the cessation of one's life, then suicide is rational. So, and then suicide is unnatural is the next section on page 174. And I can't remember what the actual arguments are for suicide being unnatural. I know that there are some theological arguments that it's unnatural, and I'm not sure if he addresses those. And then he does address at the bottom of page 175 the argument that suicide is unnatural because it goes against our natural desire or our natural drive to continue living and procreate, which I shouldn't spend too much time on because we've already sort of explained that in previous chapters. Saying that, not only is it sort of a logical fallacy to say that because something is a certain way, that's the way it ought to be, or the ought from is argument, also called the naturalistic fallacy for obvious reasons, but also just the assumption that something is unnatural in the first place. You could, I think, equally make the argument that because it does occur, because humans are a part of nature and we do sometimes commit suicide, that it is therefore a part of natural life just as much as not wanting to commit suicide or trying to continue to live and procreate is also part of natural life. So that argument I don't think holds up horribly well. He talks about suicide as cowardice and says that oftentimes suicide is not cowardly at all. And, for obvious reasons and for reasons that we've, I think, addressed earlier, that death is not an attractive or a favorable escape from the human predicament. Benatar makes, I think, a strong case that cowardice is probably not the best characterization of suicide because of how scary and unpleasant one's own annihilation often seems to most people. And then interests of others, and that's where he gets into the argument I mentioned earlier about having other people depending on you. And then, so the finality of death. On page 179, finally, there is the finality argument from the indisputable premise that death is final or irreversible. Some people infer that for this reason we should not carry out suicide. This argument takes a number of forms. And he concedes, at the bottom of page 180, that last paragraph, there's something to be said for each of these non-lethal responses. For example, if one's burdens are for the moment relatively minor and the costs of suicide are great, then enjoying one's life, despite the burdens, may indeed be the most reasonable reaction. So he does concede that, although the finality of death is something to consider in weighing suicide against continued living, it is not sort of a be-all, end-all argument against suicide. For similar reasons that, death, even outside of suicide, is also final. That does not make a very strong case that one should not prematurely end one's life if it is of sufficiently poor quality. And then on page 182, broadening the case for suicide, he, again, as I said, I think defends suicide pretty strongly, extending it to, say, sort of referencing back to chapter 4 in the quality of life, saying that people who have a more accurate assessment of life's quality may thus view their lives as sufficiently bad, and may have, as he argues, reason to want to end their lives. And he sort of uses this section to extend the argument beyond, terminal patients, or at least, what I'm saying is that he extends the rationality for suicide beyond people in unusually unpleasant situations, or people with especially abhorrent qualities of life, or people who have a terminal illness and whose condition is only going to deteriorate until they, suffer sort of a painful or very unpleasant death. He says that although suicide is, of course, rational for people in those situations, it's rational for those people to, want to prematurely end their lives. It is also sometimes reasonable for people who have what many of us would consider maybe a more average quality of life, but perceive it to be of a lower quality, or perceive it, as Benatar would argue, more accurately. And on page 186, there's a good sort of graph that helps you visualize that, with that diagonal dotted line being sort of someone's perception of life tracking 1-to-1 with their actual quality. So if they fall along that dotted line somewhere, it would mean that their perception of their life is exactly, accurate with the actual quality of their life. If they were to the right of that line, as the dotted line, as Benatar argues many people are, they would have sort of a unrealistically optimistic view of their life. If they were to the left of that line, they would view their life as of poorer quality than it actually is. And he even argues that if someone is to the left of that line and is contemplating suicide, then it is reasonable for us, for friends of those types of people, or for people of those opinions, to try and pull them back towards center, or try and pull them back toward a more accurate view of their own lives. On page 194, restoring an individual's control. Again, going back to arguments made in the suicide is murder, which is that, people should have a sort of agency over their own lives and ability to end it prematurely. And I don't know if I need to read anything from that section. And then the conclusion, again, can't stress enough how helpful it is to read the conclusions in, again, understanding the broader picture, the broader arguments that he makes, that Benatar makes in each of these chapters, and the concluding paragraph, or concluding chapter 8, in understanding the broader arguments overall and, throughout the book. So I won't belabor that. I won't continue to talk your ear off about those anymore. You can read those for yourself if you are struggling with anything or just want a clearer interpretation of Benatar's arguments. So, using that, hopefully this video will be sort of a helpful guide through the major points, and also the podcasts that I posted and that will have been uploaded by the time this video is up on YouTube. Hopefully that'll give you guys a good sort of overview of Benatar and his arguments, as I hope that the rest of the materials throughout the course have given you a good sort of overview of the arguments made by Dawkins, Coyne, Darwin, etc. So, I think that's about it. Again, exam will be posted on noon on Wednesday, this Wednesday. And you will have a week from them to complete it, but keep in mind also that the discussion forum and reaction paper for this class and your response to two of your classmates also due this Saturday at 9 a.m. So, okay, that's it. That's the last you'll see of my face for the rest of this semester. But if you do have any questions or concerns if you have any questions or comments or concerns or anything, please feel free to email me or Dr. Shackelford. And we do keep in close contact with one another, so I'll try to, if you email me, keep in mind that I will try to copy him on the email response back so that he's in the loop, and he will try to do the same thing with me, so that we're both just, on the same page with everything. And again, I know I said this earlier, but if you guys want to submit drafts of your exam ahead of time and get feedback on them, you can do that up until 24 hours before it's due. So that'll be noon on the 23rd. That's the cutoff line for feedback. So if you want feedback on your exam before you submit it, get it into me by email, 12 noon, Tuesday, June 23rd. The exam is due 12 noon, June 24th, Wednesday, the day after. And that'll be due via Moodle submission. I know I already explained this earlier in the video, but just wanted to make it as clear as possible. So, that's it. Thanks, and goodbye.